The event called the Reformation of the 16th century has great importance for the Reformed Church in America. We remember and celebrate it as one of the foundations on which we stand, and we cherish the insights into the Christian faith that it has handed down to us. What then was the Reformation? Historians treat the Reformation as a broad, complex movement with many social, political, and economic aspects as well as religious ones, and they debate the question of when it can truly be said to have begun. But no one doubts that its famous public beginning point occurred in 1517, when the theologian Martin Luther published his so-called 95 Theses against the selling of what were called indulgences. And the insights that Luther expressed at that moment still serve for us as a key to understanding the Reformation. At the heart of Luther's thinking was his conviction that God's saving forgiveness of sinful human beings was God's action, not ours, that it comes to us, that is, by God's grace alone, sola gratia, and is not contingent on anything that we do or that the church does, but rather that we receive it passively, by faith alone, sola fidei, that is, by trusting God. This was his critique of indulgences, whereby the Catholic Church itself had claimed a role in dispensing God's forgiveness. Luther's central insight that our salvation comes only through God's grace and not through our own works was not a new insight. Luther himself had, of course, found it in the Scriptures, especially in the letters of Paul. And indeed, this was an insight that had not been forgotten in the many centuries that separated Paul from Luther. The great church father Augustine of Hippo, most famously, had stated it very powerfully in the 5th century in his debates with the so-called Pelagians, who had by contrast ascribed to humans an active role in their own salvation. And Augustine's influence in this, as in other respects, remained strong within the Catholic tradition, making its appearance in many contexts and with varied implications over time. What was new then in Luther? What caused the sensation and upheaval in the years that followed in the wake of the publication of the Theses? The cause was not only his conviction, shared soon by others, of the principle of salvation by grace alone received by faith, but the combination of this conviction with another increasingly shared conviction, one that in fact in Luther's case took a little while longer to clarify, and had particular significance in his political and social context, where patterns of power in society were shifting. This was the conviction that the authoritative source of Christian truth was to be found in the Scripture alone, sola scriptura, as distinct from the church traditions that had interpreted it. In the case of indulgences and the theological understanding behind them, Luther was saying, the church had strayed from the truth that was in Scripture. This meant that the traditions of the church could in fact be wrong, and its authority thrown into question. It was this conclusion, as Luther and others would embrace it, that underlay the enormous changes in Christendom that were to follow, and to which we give the name Reformation. So the Reformation stands as a fundamental and revolutionary rethinking of the question of religious authority. Those who came soon to be called Protestants, who included Luther and his immediate followers, but also many others as well, elevated the Bible as the Word of God above all other presumed authorities, which they regarded as merely human. It is hard for us to grasp the significance of this rethinking, for it was not that the Catholic Church had ever rejected the authority of Scripture. On the contrary, the ancient Catholic tradition had established and conserved the canon, that is, the list of books that constituted the Scripture, and the Church, in continuity with that tradition, considered the Scripture so constituted as having been entrusted by Christ himself to his apostles and their successors, that is, to the Church, as its guardian and interpreter. Thus, the authority of Scripture was of a piece with the authority of the Church. And this conception of religious authority was part of the foundation of the very order of European society. What the Reformation did in elevating Scripture above church was to undermine that foundation and consequently that order, thus the upheaval. The implications of this rethinking of religious authority were huge. For once the authority of Scripture was elevated above that of the Church, the obvious next question was, who then decides what the Scripture means? Who interprets it? Indeed, a variety of groups and movements, Protestants of many types, emerged almost immediately, each claiming to interpret the Scripture definitively and differing not only from what they thought of now as the Roman Catholic Church, that is, as one Christian tradition, indeed for them a false one, but also from each other in matters small and large. The ostensible unity of Christendom was now destroyed, and even the Catholic Church, though it resolutely maintained its historic conception of itself in relation to Scripture, participated in this rethinking of religious authority, for in reasserting its traditional doctrines at the Council of Trent, and in a certain resurgence of its vitality in the years that followed, the Catholic Church implicitly acknowledged the new role that individual assent would have to play in the acceptance of these within the new situation of a plurality of beliefs. For us in the Reformed Church in America, the great legacy of the Reformation lies in this fundamental revision of the notion of religious authority that it brought about, and more particularly, to return to the concerns of Luther at its outset, in its guarantee of the great doctrine of salvation by grace alone, received by faith alone, and founded on Scripture alone. This doctrine has come down to us not precisely through the legacy of Luther and his immediate followers, the Lutherans, who were concentrated in central Germany and Scandinavia, but rather through the so-called Reformed tradition, which began separately in the cities of Switzerland and spread to, among other places, the Netherlands, and with some distinctive traditions of its own, but which affirmed the same fundamental and scripturally based doctrine of salvation. We remember and accept that doctrine of salvation as the Reformation's great legacy. But it's important to note in closing that we also acknowledge a tragedy of the Reformation, namely its violence. The plurality of religious groups that it engendered led to devastating wars of religion, as the historians call them, which lasted through the middle of the 17th century. For though the Reformation inevitably raised the question of who decides what the Scripture means, it did not manage to find an answer that would allow adversaries to live together in peace. That is, in the time of the Reformation, there was not yet, or there were only the barest glimmerings of, an idea of religious toleration. Such an idea was to take hold only later, in our case especially, in some developments in the Netherlands and in America in the centuries that followed, which we also remember and celebrate. But that's another story.